A few words about it. First of all, the ADF leadership is genuinely committed. This is not a passing fad. A lot of focus has been on David Morrison, and some of the criticisms he's come in for has been really bad. And for instance, attempts to denigrate him in his job as Chief of Army because some people didn't like the cultural direction he wanted to go, I think is second rate, to say the least. David Morrison sits squarely within the mainstream of cultural change in the ADF. If you go back to Peter Cosgrove, you go back to Angus Hewson, you go back to David Hurley. David Hurley, who's now Governor of New South Wales, and General Cosgrove, who's now the Governor General. What David Morrison, Mark Binskin and other senior ADF leaders have been doing has been within the mainstream of that cultural change. I think some of the criticisms of David have been the engagement of a wider cultural issue that sits behind it, and they've used him as a stalking horse. I know you didn't ask about it, but I wanted to make some comments on that.
No, I'm glad you did. Defence seems to get particular criticism over these issues. Do you think that's warranted?
Oh, look, some of it is. I think historically there has been some. Everyone has to face up to their history, and none of us have histories which are pure. The sexual abuse task force that was headed up by Len Roberts-Smith, that has dealt with around 2,500 complaints. A lot of the leadership of the ADF and myself have taken part in what they call restorative justice sessions, which some people against whom wrong had been done wanted to engage in. You can't engage in those sessions without coming away with a deep feeling of what behaviour can do in the destruction of people. So we all have to face up to that. And I think the ADF leadership has been, I think they have been, I think they are exemplars, as you say, in the way they have faced up to that. I see it personally on a daily basis. I know what their commitment is. I feel it. And like every group of leaders who go through, who are leading change of that magnitude, there is resistance and it leads to controversy. But their determination to press ahead with it, certainly shouldn't be questioned, and I think they deserve full marks for what they've done.
I might throw it out to questions in a moment, but before we do, I might take up your invitation to at least tempt you to talk about some of the issues in the white paper tomorrow. A report this morning in a very authoritative newspaper suggested there would be some expansion of the number of ADF personnel. You've talked today about how you've reduced numbers. How does
public servants, not ADF.
So the expansion we're talking about is likely to be more uniformed people or frontline, should we say?
Nick, I've been in government 47 years. I've not yet got sacked, and I don't intend to get sacked tomorrow.
Well, as though you're asking about the submarine building program, we'll come on to that in a minute. But look, we've got many people in the audience with great interest in defence, either in the industry, in the department, other areas. I'll throw it open to questions.
leave that one aside. Oh, sorry. The other one is just a clarifier, actually, and that's on the personal observation you made at the start. Did I understand you correctly in saying you about ungoverned spaces, that you believe that Australian troops would be deployed in such spaces for 20 to 30 years?
No, it's not that I believe that. I think that there is a fair chance that over, if you look ahead 20, 30 years, we could find ourselves going to places which we don't often talk about today. And I stress that that's a personal view on my part. It certainly does not represent a government view. But and if we do, it would be under the UN or some similar umbrella.
Jim Molan, could you explain a bit about how you think contestability might work, just the mechanics of it and where we're up to in implementing it?
Contestability, which should be part of a healthy organisation, sends shutters around different parts of defence, and which I think is interesting. What we need to avoid is a ADF public service divide. The leadership across defence is very conscious of that. So we're setting up contestability which will have both ADF and public servants. And with the ADF, the leadership of the ADF are engaged to the point where the people who they put in it from the uniform side are not people who won't have a job in 3 years' time. They are people who will have a continuing career. And Jim, having been in the ADF, you know what I mean by that. We had a contestability space in the 90s, and people have very sensitive memories about all of that. Apparently became quite destructive. So the contestability space will need to be occupied by people who think strategically, who don't see themselves as second guessing, but who see themselves in adding value in terms of providing independent advice relating to capability needs, cost, schedule and the like. We are doing that in a way that will hopefully lead to greater confidence within government that when Defence puts forward proposals for big expenditure, that it has been through a rigorous process. And it is for that reason that on the newly formed Investment Committee in Defence, we have a Deputy Secretary from the Department of Finance. We're bringing them into the tent, not to make them part of the crime, but to hopefully make them part of the solution.
Thanks very much for that talk, Dennis. Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times. You mentioned the Tang Review and the way in which the 5 different departments were brought into one. I wonder whether or not you think that now, with you mentioned, for example, that something like a third of the department are working in DSTO, they're working in intelligence, they're working in other areas. We've also got additional development, for example, cyber. I mean, the People's Republic of China actually recognise cyber as being an entirely different branch of the military. They also have their rocket force. I don't think Australia will get a rocket force for some time to come. But do you think that we need to consider alternative ways of looking at defence or structuring defence? And if so, how do you organise remuneration and pay for people who may be, for example, have a speciality in cyber, which doesn't match any of the usual military training, going to do courses, gradually getting more and more importance? How do you organise that?
Okay, first of all, I don't think cyber and what's developing there will necessarily it will not in the short term lead to structural change in defence. I think over the next 10 to 20 years, I think there will be some structural change in that space. That's speculation on my part, but you won't see immediate structural change. In terms of remuneration, we already have a system in the department where we allow up to 20% remuneration over and above the norm in certain classifications where people have particular critical skills. And on the ADF side, you might have seen the remuneration decision by the Remuneration Tribunal a few weeks ago in relation to submariners, where they're getting a special leg up. So we already have systems in place that allow for that. Now, one of the a lot of people when they look at pay scales in defence will say, oh, we've got X number of people being paid at Deputy Secretary level. Well, that's right, but not all of those people are doing Deputy Secretary jobs. You try recruiting a General Manager of submarines where you need a global search and try offering that person a division head salary and see how far you get. You might get something that'll do well in a bathtub, but not much else.
This is a growing challenge, isn't it? I mean, you need more and more specialist skills, people with these skill sets that are in demand across industry. How do you deal with this? How are you going to deal with this within the current pay structure?
Well, in the cyberspace, what we offer is really interesting jobs. The pay may not always match what some can get elsewhere, but I'll tell you what, the challenge in the interest of the job outweighs most other jobs on offer. And that does attract certain people. However, you do need that capacity to move 20% above the normal pay scales in order to pay certain specialists, and we do that on a selective basis. Equally, I could mention a recent person in defence, not by name, but who got something like a 10-fold increase in salary by going off to Google. I mean, you simply can't match that. No. And you're not going to have a lot of people who fall into that sort of category.
Dennis, you mentioned the challenges of procurement, the need to get the department realistic about time frames and budgets and deadlines. Is there a model you've seen either within other defence forces or in industry generally that you think could be a good model for defence?
No, including in industry. You know, if I look at big industries, if I look at people engaged in the most complex challenges akin to our own, such as offshore platforms and the like, I don't exactly see a great record of cost and schedule. There are some inherent challenges in defence. You know, when you are take the Joint Strike Fighter. That work on that, I think, in the States probably started in the late 90s. We signed up to be a partner in that in the early 2000s. That is a capability that will come in around 2020, and it will be our main strike weapon for the following 20, 30 years. To be making decisions now about platforms that you're bringing in sometimes in decades' time, which has then got to be competitive for the next 20, 30 years, you are inherently at what they call the cutting edge. The future submarines, from the time we make a decision on submarines until the time we get our first one will be somewhere between 7 and 10 years. And then we will be building our last ones, in the 2030s, in the 2040s. And it will have to be competitive out until 2050, 2060. These are just inherently big challenges, and I don't see any magic bullet around. The First Principles Review has made some very good suggestions about simplification, and I think sometimes we allow the magnitude of the challenge to overwhelm us, and our processes become too complex and too bureaucratically driven. And I think we certainly have to seek to, in the context of all that complexity, we have to simplify our processes. But I don't see any magic bullet anywhere. Perhaps others do. Yes. Magic bullet.
Once again, for the calibre of their speakers. I guess my first, twofold, I guess. You mentioned that the implementation of the recommendations of the First Principle Review, there's something like 27% that you haven't yet got to.
No, 27% we've done.
Oh, you've done?
However, not 20% of the substance.
Yes. Well, that probably even emphasises my question. What level of confidence do you have about your ability to actually implement the remaining?
Oh, we will.
And what sort of time frame would that occur?
Okay. The First Principles Review recommended a 2-year implementation time frame. That takes us through until July of 2017. There's only one of the recommendations that I think may be difficult to achieve by then, and that is a professionalisation of all parts of the workforce. I think that's a bit harder than what people think for a variety of reasons, and I think that will take longer than 2 years. However, we're going to do it, and we'll do it within 2 years, and I'll tell you why. Because the Chief of the Defence Force and myself and other people in Defence are determined to get it done. We will do it. I know that sounds a bit, but I'd be prepared to sit here on the 1st of July of 2017 and be held to account for what has been achieved or what hasn't been achieved. One good thing about this review is that, first of all, the review was very keen to consult across political parties. And if you go back to when the First Principles Review was launched in April of last year, you won't find a lot of public criticism from the opposition. That's not because it had bipartisan support. It is because the First Principles Review team, led by David Peaver, formerly of Rio Tinto, was very careful to consult former defence ministers on both sides of the aisle and to consult with the opposition. The government was very careful to ensure that the opposition got proper briefings on the First Principles Review and its recommendations before it said anything publicly. Now, that does not guarantee anything, but I think it provides the right space in which to have confidence. Finally, I would note that the Oversight Board consists primarily of the people who did the review. They have a vested personal interest in ensuring that what they hold dear to their heart is delivered. They have independent access to the government. which keeps us honest. So I'm confident that we will do what we're meant to do.
If I can ask one more question. I want to commend you for the more innovative approaches in acquisition, particularly I think the CEPs in the naval space has got incredible potential. I mean, we in industry sometimes have a 10-year business development cycle for large projects, which is, ultimately that costs the Australian taxpayer an enormous amount of money. Do you foresee that CEPs will be applied more broadly across the acquisition sphere?
I don't know the answer to that. I think it was a good model. It was controversial at the time and criticised, but I think it was a good model. And I think on certain projects it would be worth copying. Sorry? The chair made mention of retooling the nation. Yep.
The next question, the trade-off between sovereign capability and nation building or getting industry stimulation out of defence projects. What your thoughts might be in the current round of, say, submarines? Is there an element of opportunity there for us to get connected to global supply chains that we perhaps haven't in the past explored because of this need to separate out industry from defence sovereign capability?
Oh, I think there are certainly opportunities there for industry to be part of a global supply chain. Absolutely. I mean, we don't aspire to sovereign capability across the totality of the ADF. For instance, I think it'll be a long time before Australia is building its own fighter aircraft. The government is now committed to a continuous build strategy for the future frigates. I think that's really a big thing. I don't think everyone has properly absorbed just what that means. That means we'll get rid of the boom and bust cycle of naval shipbuilding. It means that we will develop a permanent workforce. We're going to have to skill that workforce up, and we're going to have it's going to have flow-on effects through industry. In respect of the submarines, as you know, the three potential design partners have been asked to come forward with options in respect of complete build in Australia, complete build offshore and hybrid. I don't want to get involved in the debate there as it's sensitive. However, I would stress again that the key thing there is that you must have sovereign capability in terms of your sustainment and your maintenance of your platforms. That is, and you can do that wherever you might build them, but that in no way is suggesting a preference for particular build strategies. Yeah.
Dennis, you skillfully avoided that question which might have got you sacked, so I thought I'd give you another one.
Richard is the defence attaché from the UK. He's interested in us buying the Type 26 frigate. He has no interest in this.
Nothing to do with ships, Dennis. In my 3 years in Australia, I've had 4 Prime Ministers, 4 Defence Ministers and 9 Assistant Ministers. What has the impact been on you doing your job with that political churn? Has that made it easier? Has it made the department more independent, or has it caused delays? So that's part one of the question. And the second part is, as you look at the outcomes from the First Principles Review, to what extent are you taking into account the need for political stability to make those processes work?
Sorry, what?
To what extent are you looking for political stability to make the new processes work?
Okay. Well, first of all, I've got no control over the latter, so it'd be foolish for me to, have any aspirations there. I've got one vote. In terms of changes of ministers, prime ministers, I'd go back to Prime Minister Turnbull's, one of his very first press conferences, in which he was asked some questions about defence, and he said, prime ministers might change, but your strategic environment doesn't. And I've always been lucky in the public sector to be working in the national security space. And I think you do get some continuity there. You get change, but you get a lot of continuity in terms of the broad dimensions of your challenges. In terms of hoping for political stability in the context of big projects and that, as I mentioned, that's beyond our gift. And one thing I have learnt is that you don't waste emotional energy over that which you can neither control nor significantly influence.
Craig Parry from Hawker Pacific. Just interested in your comments about cost culture and whether you've seen any changes when times are good budgetary-wise and when times are, more constrained, and how your projects and your decision-making changes in those times of boom and bust, just in relation to government commitment to 2% GDP, etc., going forward.
Yeah, I think we're okay in that space, in that I think the government is imposing, while the defence budget is growing, the government is nonetheless rightly imposing significant disciplines on us. Hence the downsizing over the last 3.5 years. Hence the